Well, thank you, Bruce. I guess for that wonderful introduction. Actually, Bruce has been doing an amazing job today. I've been thoroughly enjoying the conference. It's been a thrill to be here. It's lovely being back in Bucharest. It's one of the cities that I thoroughly enjoy visiting. So thank you first of all for having me. I was anxious actually as I was watching a few of the other presentations that lots of people were referencing Surma from the Chrome team, and I didn't have any quotes in there, so I quickly shoehorned one in so I could quote Surma as well. It's not a legitimate quote, but I had to be not be the only person who didn't reference him. But I can't spend any time on that because the time is ticking away. In fact, let me get this rolling as well here. Bush. Gosh, okay. Yeah, time is ticking away, and I'm really conscious about overrunning. I really hate overrunning. I've even invested in one of these devices so that my wrist will vibrate if I get close to overrunning. I'll try and honor that. I know this won't run out of battery life during my talk because it comes with a very handy kind of wireless charger, so I can just put my phone against my watch against it, the charger as I sleep. It looks like this. This is my wireless charger, and I'm all in on wireless charging now. It's made my life way easier. I use one of these for my phone. I actually use this one on my desk, so I just need to pop it down there. I don't need to plug anything in. So wireless charging, I'm all in. Except if you notice this wireless charger, there's this thing. And don't be fooled by the crops of these images of the wireless chargers that I snaffled from Amazon. We all know that there's stuff happening just off the edges of there. In fact, if you do start Googling around, like searching around for wireless chargers, you fall down a rabbit hole quite quickly. I don't know what's going on with this thing. This is a wireless charger that you plug in so that you can adapt another wireless charger to it with a wire. I don't know what's happening. The point I'm inelegantly making is that we kind of accept this term wireless. You know, we use it for Wi-Fi, we use it for charging now. We don't really talk too much about it. Use this phrase, however. Ooh, you'll get opinions. You'll get opinions. People will look at you and say, I think you'll find there is a server. And indeed there is. Of course, there's a server in the serverless world. But critically, it's not a server that you need to care about or kind of can include in your problem space. And I love that because that means that you can focus on the thing that you care about when you're a developer. You can focus on the things you need to care about, the kind of things that might differentiate the things you're building from your competitors. Just having a server that stays up should kind of be table stakes, really. So it's nice that you can focus on other things. I like to think that by using some of these tools, we can be liberated to focus on what really matters, and we'll get to that. I have a history of working at various kind of agencies. I've worked at some large agencies over the years. I've been doing some fairly big projects. And the problem with doing big projects is that they come with all kinds of constraints and complexity and infrastructure. There's a lot to take on. So I love being able to get as much of this out of my problem and out of my house and put that into someone else's plate. This gives us a chance to think a little bit more about where we focus our efforts. And Chris Coyier, I don't know if you've come across Chris Coyier, big voice on the web, founder of CSS Tricks. This is taken from a talk that he prepared for JAMstack conference earlier in the year, and he was talking. His talk title is amazing. It was, "Oops, I guess we're all full stack developers now," and the we, and that is front-end developers. And he's kind of referring to this spectrum of things that we might need to consider part of our skill set as web developers. And it reaches all the way back to the operating system and all the way through to the front of the stack into things that live in the browser. And one of the things that's kind of evolved and changed a little bit over the years is that we can start to, as front-end developers, spend a little bit less time in this part of the stack, the LAMP stack or the kind of equivalent of that, and focus more on the things that we might be particularly skilled in, the things that can differentiate what we're building, the front-end technologies. It's a really great talk. I'll share the links to this a bit later on. I love this kind of thing. My background is in front-end development. I've done lots of technical architectures as well, but I'm not necessarily like an expert in database schemas or management or server maintenance or all of that kind of stuff. I love thinking in lines of boxes. I love thinking about the flow and how things might stitch together. But I don't want to become an expert in every single piece of the stack, and we'll come to that in a few moments. As Bruce so kindly introduced me, my name is Phil Hawksworth, and I work in the developer experience team at Netlify. My pronouns are he, him. I'm happy to take questions either at the end or around about at the drinks after. If you'd rather just tweet questions at me, that's fine as well. I'm at Phil Hawksworth on Twitter. Happy to take any questions that might come up. A little bit more of background of me. Recently had this published that I wrote with my boss, one of the co-founders of Netlify, modern web development on the JAMstack. You can get this for free online. You can go to find that at JAMstack book to get that. Again, I'll share these links later on. In fact, this kind of URL shortener, find that at, that'll surface a few times throughout the talk, so you don't have to keep remembering the first part. I'll try and make it easy if you just want to jump into something. The slides are available online now at find that at servered. And in fact, if you just search for find that at, you'll get a blog post about how I made that URL shortener with some of the techniques that we're going to talk about here as well. So it can get a bit meta if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But what are we talking about? Well, the title of this talk, Are You Being Servered? I keep on reading it out loud as Are You Being Severed? That's a different talk entirely. Are you being servered? I'm my own worst enemy. I was trying to be a bit of a smartass with this talk title. I don't know if the reference will even land here because there's a 70s British television show called Are You Being Served? Did that make it over to Romania? A show of hands? There's one tentative hand, which is, actually, this is great for you, because really everything you need to know about the show is kind of embodied in this photograph. It was a horrific thing, full of kind of small-mindedness and cliche from the 70s, and as such, it became a huge cult classic overseas. When I was looking for this picture, I also discovered this picture. I discovered that this was available as a DVD, so it lived on long after it should have been dead and buried. In fact, there was even a movie. Again, everything you need to know is right there in that. So for the one person that had seen this on the behalf of the people of Britain, I apologize. Although any apology from a Brit needs to be kind of passive-aggressive, so I'll use the English spelling of apologize, just to make me feel good. But again, we're kind of getting off-piste a little bit. You know, what's the point of this talk? Well, as you might imagine, serverless is going to feature here. Serverless can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I tend to often use it as a shorthand for saying functions as a service. So being able to run functions on someone else's infrastructure without having any care about the environment that it lives in. But I'm also going to use this term to do with serving websites without web servers. Now, this slide is one that often kind of provokes a few raised eyebrows in the audience, but I would refer you back to this slide earlier on. So again, yes, there are servers that exist, but they're not necessarily servers that you need to care about in your building and deployment of websites. And this is a core tenet of something that's become known as the JAMstack. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go. The JAM in JAMstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. Again, we're going to come back to this a little bit, but you might rightly be thinking, do we really need another stack or another name? We've got them coming out of our ears. Thank you very much. And that's fair. But it does serve a particular purpose. I'll try and unpack it a little bit. So trying to describe a little bit more what JAMstack means beyond the acronym. Try to define it a little bit like this, which is a modern architecture, create fast and secure sites and dynamic apps with JavaScript, APIs, and pre-rendered markup served without web servers. And that's this kind of meant to be a snappy, descriptive definition of what this might mean. But it could still mean all kinds of things. You might be thinking, well, is this just really just a new name for static websites? And you're not far wrong. I think that's fair, but I think we can go a little bit further, and we'll do that in a moment. But realistically, a lot of these things aren't necessarily new. The term bake, don't fry was popularized by Aaron Swartz in a blog post that he wrote way back when, where he was talking about the desire to simplify the complexity of his infrastructure by, rather than serving up views to his content on demand, frying it on demand, he would bake it ahead of time so it's ready, so he could serve it very, very simply. He wrote this in 2002, so again, this isn't necessarily a new model, and that's fine. But he said this in his post. He said, I care about not having to maintain cranky AOL server, Postgres, and Oracle installs, and I'm right there with him. Couldn't agree more with that. Thank you very much. But this idea, since it's been around from 2002 or beyond, why is it interesting? Well, the reason I'm talking about it much more these days is because I think the ecosystem has changed. There are so many tools and enablers that now can take what we might think traditionally as a static site to do so much more than it might have done in the past. So I want to talk about this a little bit. What can a static site even be, you might ask? Well, there are a few contenders that seem to sit very squarely in the land of we can serve that statically. Things like documentation sites, React itself can be served statically, of course, and the React site is a pre-rendered, statically served site. Likewise, for things like Yarn, again, this is a statically pre-rendered site. Not every example has to come necessarily from Facebook. Things like the Vue.js site is also statically pre-generated. Not every example is necessarily good, of course. This morning we heard from Alex where he cited an example from code.gov, and he said this. He said, it's a static site. It downloads 450 kilobytes of JavaScript. And believe me, show me an architecture and I can make it go slowly. There's no silver bullet for anything. We have to be very judicious with what we build. He went on to say this. I couldn't pronounce that, but there were feelings, and I was nodding along aggressively. Because this is a really common trap we might think of when we think about static sites and doing things with JavaScript. I mentioned the JAM in JAMstack stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. So we might start thinking, well, this kind of means doing everything with JavaScript in the front end. And that's not the case at all. You can certainly do that where it's appropriate, and I'd argue there are some cases where that's appropriate. But a trap that some people might fall into is thinking that JAMstack means JavaScript and APIs and markup at all time. And the secret kind of is that you don't need to use all three of these. It's just a convenient term for talking about moving away from the operating system, getting closer to the runtime that lives in the browser, and starting to do things with APIs and JavaScript on top of that where it's appropriate. So there are examples of this kind of thing that could be a little bit more dynamic than the things I mentioned before. Smashing Magazine is a common kind of example of this. This is a site that's been statically generated using Hugo, a popular Go-based static site generator, pre-rendered and served directly from a CDN, and then progressively enhanced with small bits of JavaScript and serverless functions to provide things like comments and membership and targeted content and e-commerce. When they moved from their previous stack, which was actually a collection of different PHP stacks and a few other things, it was heavily built on WordPress, they got a 10x improvement in performance when they made that jump. So there were motivations for them doing that. Another example, got a name check earlier on, Squoosh.app. This is a statically served web application. Now, this is something that does a lot with JavaScript and WebAssembly, but it's served statically. So you can do as I do, and I run it as a desktop application, and it's a joy. It lets you compress images, and you can upload an image to it, and you can see the before and after of the compression. Oh, I'm sorry, this image has been unfortunately cropped. That's too bad. To quote Alex Russell, goodness. So, moving on to other examples, and forgive me for kind of just shamelessly showing you my own site, which again is just a blog. There's nothing necessarily exotic here. There's the article about this URL shortener, so we're already falling down this rabbit hole. It's got things like live search on there, which is a progressive enhancement using JavaScript, but it falls back to using an asynchronous call out to Google. But otherwise, it's just a blog with posts on there. But one of the things that it also has is it's got my Instagram feed and it's got my Twitter feed on there. And there are techniques for bringing those into the browser without having to do anything at the server to grab those bits of content. But I don't necessarily want to put everything into JavaScript in the front end. So what I actually do is every time I tweet, I fire an event that tells my site to redeploy. It will say, okay, run another build, pull the content in from Instagram, from Twitter, bake it into the site, and redeploy. And that happens completely automatically. It's unattended, and I use these things. So this is a little glimpse behind the scenes. This is the view of the admin for my site, which is hosted on Netlify, as you might imagine with me working there. And what I've got here is I've got a few build hooks. Now these are triggers that will cause my site to rerun the build in the continuous integration environment there, and then redeploy. And the top one you can notice is Twitter activity. And that's triggered whenever if this then that, which is a system that will monitor different events and then cause different triggers to fire. Whenever it sees me tweet, it fires that. The site regenerates and I get up-to-date tweets. You'll also notice this trigger on there, which is the Alexa voice command. Because if you can, why would you not stand at home and say, deploy my website, and have things happen. The gesture, by the way, is very important. It doesn't work without it. So I've been really excited about this. I'm excited about this kind of automation and triggering events and stitching things together this way. So I've been talking about that for a little while, getting excited. And I did this to the extent that on Twitter I was getting a little bit cocky, and then some people on the internet noticed, and that's a terrifying thing, because then I received this tweet from Zach Leatherman, who some of you may know from his work in optimizing web font loading and those kind of things. And he poked this, I'm fairly sure, in my general direction, where he said, okay, a free side project idea, an HTML-only static site-generated clock that deploys a new version to Netlify every minute, which is absurd. Of course, that's not the way we build clocks. So I looked at this for a while, and I thought about it. And my evening's activity changed a little bit. I found myself exploring this for a while and seeing whether or not it was a sensible thing to do or not. And I responded to Zach. I said, only an idiot would make the thing that you are suggesting. Here it is. So if any of you want to know the time at the moment, you can go to setyourwatchbynetlify.com, or you can go to findthat@/time, and fingers crossed, it will show you the time. And what this is doing is it's a static site generator that whenever it runs, it takes the server time and it spits it onto a page. It actually does it a few times because it does it in different time zones, because there's different time zones around the world, it turns out. And so depending on where you access that from, I will route you to the correct page where it will just show you a static page, which all it does is say, this is the time I was built. You can access that, if you want, you can navigate to each one individually, but it will automatically route you to the right one. Every 30 seconds or so, I use a meta refresh to refresh things. So I don't know, you don't want to be timing the 100-meter final for the Olympics, but it'll get you just about right. And the way that I do this is I'm triggering a build every minute, and I do this using something called webtask.io, and there are lots of services like this around. What I'm ultimately doing is I've got a small serverless function that Webtask generously hosts for me, and all that is doing is it's making a post request to a webhook, exactly like I showed you for my Twitter account, for my website, that pulls in the tweets, and it fires off a new build. And it does that every minute of every day, and it's done that now, how many times? 513,901 times. So this will run again every minute, and it's just happening there, automated without me knowing about it. Now, this is a terrible idea. I made this to prove a point, and the point was that I used to work in an environment where infrastructure and deploying to that infrastructure was daunting. Has anyone been in a situation where you were going to launch content or launch a new feature, and it was a situation of keep your phones on, we're working the weekend, we're deploying something? Has anyone kind of been in that environment before? A few weary hands have gone up. I've definitely been in that environment before. The point should be that if we do things right with this kind of architecture, we can reduce the friction to deploying sites to close to zero. And so we can automate these things so they're triggered from events. They're maybe not happening every minute, because this is an extreme example, but we can ultimately make deploying a mundane and unattended event. And that's, I think, a real enabler. That's something that takes static sites, JAMstack sites, to new levels. So over the next 20 minutes, what I want to do is I just want to talk about two kind of principles that come into play here. And these are both kind of part and parcel of the JAMstack kind of world and the JAMstack approach. One of them is pre-rendering, and I've mentioned that already, but we'll go a bit deeper. And the other one is serverless on-demand or serverless pre-rendering, serverless rendering, rather. So let's first of all talk about pre-rendering and talk about the motives for pre-rendering. Well, I like to think of it as doing the work now so your servers don't have to do it later. I love the idea of putting some distance between the complexity of the build, the things that might fail and go wrong as we're serving a request or building a view. I like putting as much distance between that and the user that's going to be coming and consuming it. So I like to do things up front. So humor me for a minute as we do a small kind of comparison, a very simplified view, but a comparison between a traditional kind of dynamic backend and a static or a JAMstack approach. So this is maybe the scenario for serving a request in a traditional model. You know, we might have a user who's visiting a page from a browser, and they make a request to see a view of something. And maybe that's hitting a CDN, but more likely it's probably going to our infrastructure, which has maybe got a load balancer in it, and that load balancer will decide what's the right web server to service that request, send the request to one of our web servers, which won't have the view necessarily in place. It might need to apply a template to some data, perform some logic, maybe needs to reach out to a database or one of our databases. So it'll make that request, the database will service that request, send the data back to the web server, which will compile that view into something we can send back to the user. We'll send it back through the web, the load balancer. Maybe some things will kind of find their way into a CDN and get cached there for later. And ultimately, we return the view into the browser and into the eyeballs of our user. So yes, there's a load balancer in there which we may not all have, but if we're building anything to serve many, many users, we probably do have something like that in there. And there are a few different boxes here, a few different arrows and boxes. Whenever we're deploying a new site, we're probably having to keep all of these things in step. We're having to change the code and the content in various different places. So there are a few different moving parts in play. So if we compare that to a JAMstack approach, what happens there in the same scenario, we've got a browser and a user makes a request for a page, and that request hits a CDN, which has a pre-generated view of the content, and it returns that to the browser and our client, and we're done. So I'm oversimplifying a little bit, and of course this isn't something that covers every scenario, but just for an illustration of the difference in complexity and the pieces of infrastructure that live in my world as a developer who's building on the JAMstack, there are one or two clear advantages for one of these over the other. So let's go a little bit deeper. Let's kind of think about what deployment means, because I talked about the boxes that just flew off the page. We'd have to be making changes on all of those boxes. Well, now deployment for us in the JAMstack world is about getting things to the CDN as quickly as possible. We've potentially got some kind of a build that applies content and data to templates, some logic runs, maybe we'll pull content in from other systems, but it's happening at build time when we're in control of it, or it's happening in an environment unrelated and decoupled from the user's request. And then we're pushing that up to the CDN, and from there it can be served. And this kind of separation between request time and build time is key. This really kind of creates this lovely decoupled world where the complexity that might live in the build environment, if that fails, that's not going to impact what has already been deployed and is available at request time. So that's particularly attractive. So there are a few advantages that unpack from that, and I'll go through them quite quickly. There's things to do with security, performance, and scale. Let's take security first of all. Well, I think you could see just from looking at that illustration, there's a greatly reduced surface area that people could attack. If we go back to our diagram again and think about the places where people could potentially penetrate or hostile code could encroach, we need to think about securing these servers and making sure they're resilient and not open to that kind of attack. There is no server more secure than a server that doesn't exist. Those are really difficult to penetrate. And so just purely by taking this infrastructure and complexity out of the equation, there are fewer things that we have to then secure. So that's one thing. Far fewer moving parts to attack. When it comes to performance, I said we'd go through these quickly. There's a light touch. When it comes to performance, again, thinking about how far these requests have to travel and what logic might be in play when we're servicing these requests, one is inherently going to be much more performant than the other. Now, of course, we can squeeze all kinds of performance out of traditional stacks, and this is not uncommon. A typical approach for a traditional dynamic stack is to start to add layers which are basically static layers to the stack in order to improve performance. And I'm talking about caching. We start to add caching infrastructure. So there's caching that we might put on the web servers that kind of tries to pre-bake some of the common requests and make sure they're cached and ready to serve immediately. We might do that at the database layer as well and cache common requests to the database so that we're not doing those every time. Throughout the load balancer and even, the CDN is effectively a big content, the content delivery network is effectively a big cache. So there's layers of caching that comes in here. But the difference here is that they aren't entirely cached. Some things are dynamic, some things are cached, and it becomes your responsibility to figure out what's cached, how and when, and manage the logic of that throughout. This is something that I will 100% of the time mess up, so I like that to not be my problem. I like everything to be inherently cached and pre-generated. So, scale. Traditional stacks will add infrastructure to try and increase scale and be able to serve more and more traffic. So back to our trusty diagram again. And yes, if we're starting to add caching to this, we're already starting to address the notion of how do we service a huge volume of traffic. But in the end, what we'll start doing, and anyone who's been in projects where they've been asked how much will the infrastructure cost, and you ask how much traffic will we get, you'll be familiar with this. You'll start provisioning more infrastructure, throw more servers, more machines at the problem to try and solve all of that. All of those need to be maintained from production through the QA, through the testing environments, all the staging environments, all of those kind of things. If none of that's as part of the equation, then things get simpler. And it's this decoupling which provides this kind of increased simplicity. It's all then about getting things to the CDN. Deploying things is getting things to one place, to the CDN, and that simplifies things. There are lots of companies trying to help with this at the moment, and it's becoming a popular model. It's not necessarily suitable for every single type of site, but it's becoming more and more popular. So there are lots of providers who will kind of help with the workflow of getting things to a CDN and serving those things for you, Netlify being just one of those. So, okay, I mentioned we'd talk about pre-rendering, and serverless rendering is the other one that I want to talk about. So let's go on to serverless rendering. Because serverless, does that play part and parcel of the JAMstack? Well, yeah, I guess maybe serverless feels like it fits into this kind of this strange definition. It's something that's served without web servers, but and they can be very useful. A serverless function can do great things for us because sometimes you can't pre-generate everything. Sometimes you just need a little bit of logic on a server, whether that's doing things like proxying secrets to API calls that you wouldn't want to have your secret in the client. You can put that on a serverless function that you wouldn't want to create a whole server for. There are loads of times where serverless functions or functions as a service can come to the rescue. Now, I want to take just a moment just to share a word of caution, and that's that it can be tempting if you start going down this route. Just think, I'm going to recreate everything I used to do on my traditional stack in serverless functions and just do everything there. And that's tempting, but just, I'd urge a word of caution. I'm smiling a little bit because I'm seeing what my next slide is. I'm presenting from a modern MacBook Pro. Has anyone got one of these that has the occasional issue with the keyboard? Anyone encountered these? The key that sticks for me is the command key. So occasionally when I want to paste something, I'll just type the letter S into, and that's what I've just seen there. So that's okay though, because we have this slide. Because the point I was hoping to make before my MacBook wanted to rugby tackle me and stop me doing so was that serverless functions feel like they fit perfectly in here, But it doesn't quite satisfy one aspect of the JAMstack, which is the pre-rendered markup. We're not necessarily going to be pre-rendering with serverless. Those are going to be servicing things on the fly. So that's what I would have illustrated right there. Because if you do start to do that, if you do start to re-implement everything in serverless functions and port your traditional infrastructure across there, yes, you might be free from managing that infrastructure, which is a nice feature, but you're not free from all of the logic that you're recreating there. If you can move to a static model first, which again I'll talk about a little bit more, that can simplify the model for you. I really like to think about augmentation or enhancement rather than simplifying a complex stack. I like to think about starting as simple as possible and then augmenting with things that feel a little bit closer to being dynamic. Marcus Schork of Unilever talks about static first, which I really like as a mental model. And I want to illustrate that mental model to you with an example. So the example that I put together as a little proof of concept is something I thought the world needed. It's Virtual Lollipop. It's a site where you can go in, create a lollipop by choosing the colors of the flavors, addressing it to someone, write a message, sign your name, and when you hit submit, it will give you a URL for something you can share with somebody and they'll get access to that. It's obviously very valuable and it's going to make me a millionaire somehow as soon as I figure out how to monetize it. But more importantly, it is an example of user-generated content, which doesn't feel at all like a good fit for static sites, JAMstack sites, things that are pre-rendered. So this is a perfect example of something that we can build. I want to be able to create a URL that I can share with people and they'll get that. So I made this thing as a proof of concept to kick around some ideas, and I set myself some requirements. The first of those is I wanted to pre-generate all of the pages with real URLs, even for those pages that were user-generated content. I wanted to abstract the data somewhere logical, have store the data in a database. That seemed like a right thing to do for this kind of a model, but I didn't want to become a DBA and manage that myself. I wanted to lean on someone else's expertise. And I wanted to have instant access to the new content. So I didn't want to have to wait for my site to rebuild in the way that my own blog does, that I showed earlier on. And I also didn't want to depend on client-side JavaScript to do this, which maybe I could have done. I wanted to deliver real HTML, real content to make it as performant and accessible as possible. So I chose a few tools to attack this, and the tools I chose for the pre-generating the pages, I chose a static site generator. I could have chosen, frankly, any of them, but I decided to go with Eleventy because it felt nice and simple and suitable for my needs. For the database, I chose one of the many database as a service providers that exist out there. I happened to choose FaunaDB. Again, this could have been any number of them that just creates an API that I could use to put and get my data. And for the instant access to new content, I wanted to use serverless functions. I happen to use Netlify functions, which effectively are a layer in front of AWS Lambda. But again, it fitted with my needs. Any one of these could be switched out without a problem at all. So I mentioned earlier on that I like drawing lines and boxes. I like doodling the idea and thinking about how the flow will work. So that's where I started. Now I know that this is not the most explicit and detailed specification you'll ever receive. But let me walk you through my thinking. So viewing a lollipop, viewing one of these ice lollies, what does that look like? Well, that's served from a static page. And when my static site generator runs, I generate all of these URLs, all of these pages, and I do that by querying the database to find out the pages that exist and rendering something out for each of them. The code to go off and get that data from the database looks like this, and it doesn't matter really the details of this. I just wanted to show you how much code is involved and what happens, because briefly I authenticate with the database service. I query for all of the lollies to get their data. This kind of yields a promise. I resolve the promise of those lollies when that's returned, and I catch any errors. So yeah, again, I don't really expect you to read all of this code. I just wanted to show you that it's this much, and I wanted to be able to put resolve the promise of lollies somewhere in a presentation one day because it makes me feel good. So moving on from getting a lolly, getting a view of a page, which is a static page, let's talk about saving one of these things. How do we get something into the system? Well, again, I'm serving a form effectively, and that's a statically generated, pre-generated page. It just is an HTML form. But in the scenario that I'm talking about, I'm serving everything statically. There's no server to request to receive a put request from an HTML form. So where does that go? Well, this is where a serverless function comes into place. So I have a serverless function that will save that data. That's the endpoint for my form submission, my form post. And when that receives the data, it pushes it into the Fauna DB via the API they provide. And the lolly data is stored. And so now I'll have a URL that I can send the users to. Except, of course, by this point, all I have is some data in a database. If I go to the URL for this new page, I'm going to get a 404. It doesn't exist yet because the site hasn't been rebuilt to pull that content in. And that's where I can start to lean on, the triggers and automation that I showed you before. This, again, is now starting to become familiar territory. This is the build hook for this site. I've named it New Lolly in the Freezer. And, that's the URL for that. And that is called whenever I save a lolly to the database. That's happening here in this serverless function. And again, I'm going to show you that. There's more code here, but again, it's not a lot. I'm not expecting you to read this. I just want to illustrate that I'm authenticating with the database. I'm posting the data to the FaunaDB API. When that's been successfully posted, I'm making another post request to that build hook. And then I'm sending the user off to a new URL, the URL we created for that page. They could check to see the lolly in the freezer, and that's kind of where we are. So what does check the freezer actually mean? That's fair. What's happening there is we're checking for a pre-generated page. So we're going to the URL of that page, and if we get a 200 because the page exists, it's been generated already, we'll serve that static page. Great. If it doesn't exist, though, and we get a 404, well, we can decide what to do with that 404. Instead of serving a 404 that just says, sad face, the lolly's not here, we can actually service that from a dynamic view of the serverless function. So, in other words, no, the data doesn't exist there, but exists up here. So we'll send the 404 over to this serverless function over here, which will get the data from the database for us, render the view on the fly, and send it back to the browser. That's what this code looks like. And again, let's not read it, but let's just summarize it. We get the page as a JavaScript template literal, so that's the HTML of the page. We authenticate with the database. We get the data from the database with this request keyed by the URL. And then we mash the template literal with our data that we've returned, serve that back to the user as a view. If there was no data that corresponded in the database, then it really is a 404. So then we let the user know by sending them a 404. This is my proudest moment of the entire site. I think everyone should start every project by designing their 404 page. I put a joke on the stick. You can't read that. That's fine. But it was a good moment for me. So I've got just a few minutes. I've got like 5 minutes or so. I'm going to try giving you a quick demo of this because I wanted to show you this. I wanted to show you this behind the scenes to show you how this all came together. So, first of all, I'll actually let you see what I'm seeing. Otherwise, it's going to be painful for you. So I'll just mirror the screen. There we go. Okay, so. Let me quickly pull up the admin for my page. Well, I'll show you the admin and things that are happening in the background in a second, but first of all, let's actually go to the page, and you can just about see that. So this is a static rendered page. I'll go to my form for Bucharest. Hello. I could spend all kinds of time kind of changing the colors here. I'm not going to spend too much time at all because time is short. I'll submit that. And so I've instantly got a page back, and it's not the URL that I was expecting. It's actually hit the 404, sent me off to the serverless function, and I've got an instant view of that page. Now, while that has saved things to the database, I could share this with URL with you, and if you were to go and hit that, the same thing would happen. It would give you a view of the page, that's fine, but it's actually serving that from the serverless function. If I go over to the back end here, I'll see that all of these are deploys, by the way. All of these in here are previous deploys. And we can see that we've got a new deploy that was triggered automatically by saving that data. It's a new lolly in the freezer. And if we wanted, we could go off and see the whole build running and see all the pages being generated. Oh, geez. There are a lot of... I wrote this up and published it on CSS Tricks yesterday, so people are making lollies, it seems. Ay caramba. Ours is amongst them. Now, just out of curiosity, I don't think I can see. Yeah, so the builds are still taking like 30 seconds. Let's see. If I go to this page again, how quickly will it start? Okay, so there we are. So now it is being served by a static page. It's no longer hitting that serverless function. The load is taking off there. I'm not invoking any more serverless functions. It's happening statically. Okay. So that was a quick demo, as promised. So as I mentioned, I wrote this up in detail and published it just the other day on CSS Tricks. The URL is really long, so you can find that at lollytricks. I don't know, naming short URLs is hard. But my final kind of salvo is that there are a few enablers for this, right? So first of all, there's the custom 404 routing, which is becoming more commonplace, but is trivial on this particular platform. It's a definition that looks like this in a TOML file that says for any of the unsatisfied requests to the lolly path, send the user here instead and service the request from this function instead. Events and triggers and automation can start to do great things when we're thinking about pre-generating sites and serving them statically. They start to become really interesting when you combine them. As to things like databases as a service, they provide all kinds of functionality for us where we don't have to become experts in that. Functions as a service really could do all kinds of things for us, including this serverless render or serverless server-side render. It starts to become a bit of a mouthful. Super speedy serverless server-side render. Surprisingly simple, super speedy serverless server-side render, or SAR. So there are acronyms that I'm hoping will catch on, but I think more likely thinking of them as pre-rendering and serverless rendering, they're both really useful. I'll get pulled off the stage in just a moment, but final thoughts are, there's a shift happening that I think that's really powerful, and it's something that I embraced a little while ago when I was working on architectures at an agency. And that was, rather than starting with the stack that I always used to use and then seek out opportunities to maybe simplify some things by saying, oh, this bit is cacheable, this is something I could make static, that's an area for optimization. I completely flip that on its head now. Now I think static first. I think this site will be served as pre-generated static assets unless I encounter something that it can't be. And so you start to introduce things like a serverless function here, some automation there, and it's amazing how far you can go and stay in this kind of simplified world rather than introducing all of those other bits of infrastructure. I love keeping things simple. I think simplifying is not dumbing down. Simplifying, it lets us focus on what is really important to the kind of things we're building. It makes us, allows us to keep working on infrastructure that is easier to reason about because it's decoupled, everything's got a clear purpose, and there's fewer influences from the infrastructure itself. So I think we can make impressive things with that. So my call really to you is, with all that, what should we make? With that, I need to go off and find somewhere to plug in my wireless charger. So I'll go and do that. I promised I would share some links to the resources. There's a bunch of these from the various static site generators that exist, some resources that Chris Coyer's compiled, some case studies, all kinds of bits and pieces, links in here. I would also say if you're interested in talking about this kind of thing, there is a JAMstack Slack now where meetups share their content. There's lots of discussion on there. You can join that at jamstack.org/Slack. You'd be very, very welcome. And with that, that's my time. Thank you very much for listening. My slides are there. Thanks a lot.